The earth remembers what people try to forget. Beneath quiet fields and rotting floorboards, beneath names carved into fading stone, there are stories sealed not by law or time, but by blood. This is one of them. A bloodline bound so tightly to itself that escape became impossible, and destiny turned inward, folding generation after generation into a single, suffocating fate. What you're about to hear was never meant to be spoken aloud. And once you hear it, it won't let you go. And they called it tradition at first. That's how it always begins. A choice framed as necessity, a decision explained away by isolation, by fear of outsiders, by the belief that purity meant survival. In the early years, this family lived far from roads that mattered, in a place where maps thinned out and law arrived late, if it arrived at all. Neighbors were distant, churches were scarce, and what passed between the walls of that home stayed there unchallenged, unquestioned, unrecorded. And the first records are ordinary: births, marriages, deaths, names repeating with subtle variations like echoes down a long hallway, the same surnames intertwined again and again, cousins becoming spouses, uncles becoming fathers, lines crossing until the family tree stopped branching and began collapsing inward. On paper it looks neat, efficient, almost intentional, but paper doesn't show what happens behind closed doors, or what it costs to keep blood from ever mixing with the world beyond the fence. And by the third generation something had changed. Midwives whispered. Doctors wrote careful notes they never shared aloud. Children were born smaller, slower. Some didn't speak until late, others never learned to speak at all. Eyes wandered in opposite directions, limbs bent where they shouldn't. But the family stayed, they always stayed. Leaving would mean admitting something was wrong, and admitting that would unravel everything they believed about themselves, and the land became a character in the story, a witness. The soil absorbed more than footsteps and rain. It took in screams muffled by walls, prayers whispered in fear, and the quiet, exhausted sobs of mothers who knew, deep down, that something ancient and terrible was tightening its grip. But they didn't call it a curse. They called it God's will, or bad luck, or simply the way things were, and there were moments when escape seemed possible. A child who learned quickly, a daughter who asked too many questions, a son who stared too long at the road beyond the trees. Those were the dangerous ones. Curiosity threatened the seal, and so curiosity was punished, not always with violence, but with pressure, guilt, and the weight of belonging. You don't abandon your blood, that was the rule, and rules in this family mattered more than survival. And as decades passed, the outside world changed. Wars came and went, technology crept closer, but inside the family, time stalled. The same faces aged into one another. Grandparents and grandchildren shared expressions so similar they could be mistaken for mirrors. Medical professionals tried to intervene once, quietly, cautiously. They were turned away. Outsiders always were. The family learned how to smile just enough to keep suspicion at bay, how to answer questions without saying anything at all. And what sealed the fate of this bloodline wasn't ignorance. It was knowledge without courage. They knew what they were doing. They saw the consequences stacking up like bodies in a shallow grave. But stopping would require breaking the chain, and breaking the chain would mean accepting blame, not just for one decision, but for generations of suffering. It was easier to continue, easier to let fate take the wheel and pretend it had always been heading this way. And children born into this lineage didn't inherit wealth or land or legacy. They inherited consequences, a body shaped by repetition, a mind burdened by limitation, and an unspoken understanding that their life had already been decided long before they took their first breath. Some lived quietly, some lived briefly, none lived freely, and by the time authorities finally took notice, it was already too late to undo anything. You can remove children, you can close homes, you can file reports and assign case numbers, but you can't rewind blood. You can't untangle a genetic knot pulled tight over a century. All you can do is document what remains and quietly ask how something like this was allowed to happen in a country that prides itself on progress and protection. And this story isn't about shock for the sake of shock. It's about what happens when secrecy becomes sacred, when family loyalty becomes a weapon, and when fate is mistaken for faith. The most disturbing part isn't the deformities or the diagnosis. It's the silence, the collective agreement to look away, to stay inside the walls, to let the bloodline seal itself shut rather than face the world beyond it. And because once a family chooses isolation over truth, fate doesn't need to curse them. They do it themselves, and the silence didn't break all at once. It thinned, like ice in early spring, cracking softly beneath weight no one wanted to acknowledge. The family learned to live inside that sound, the subtle warning that something was wrong, even as they pretended everything was fine. Neighbors noticed small things first. A child who never attended school. A mother who stopped waving back. Lights that stayed on all night, then went dark for days at a time. But noticing is not the same as acting, and in places like this, people mind their distance, and inside the home, routines replaced questions. Breakfast at the same hour, meals made from the same ingredients, cooked the same way, eaten in the same seats. Consistency became a shield against reality. If nothing changed, maybe nothing was wrong. Generations passed in that rhythm, each one inheriting not just genes, but habits of denial. Children learned early what not to ask. They learned which rooms were off limits, which memories were dangerous, which names were spoken only in whispers, if at all. And medical terms existed for what was happening, but they lived in textbooks, not in this house. Here there were other explanations. God was testing them. The outside world was corrupt. Blood had to stay pure because purity meant safety. These ideas were repeated so often they hardened into truth. And when truth hardens, it cuts. Mothers blamed themselves in private, while fathers blamed fate out loud. The children absorbed both, and there were moments of clarity. Late at night, when the house settled and the walls creaked like old bones, someone would lie awake and count the signs. The misaligned teeth, the tremors in small hands, the way certain words never came, even after years of trying. Those moments were dangerous, because they threatened to turn inward beliefs into outward action. And action was the one thing this family could not afford. And the land itself seemed to conspire in the isolation. Roads washed out in storms. Signals faded. Winters lingered longer than they should have. When outsiders did appear, social workers, distant relatives, curious officials, they were met with politeness and distance. Smiles without warmth. Answers without substance. The house revealed only what it had rehearsed to show. And most visitors, sensing resistance, chose the easier path. They left, and what they didn't see were the rooms where mirrors were covered, not out of superstition, but out of mercy. The places where children learned to avert their eyes from their own reflections. The quiet rituals of care that bordered on containment, hands held too tightly, movements corrected too often, lives shaped not by potential but by prevention. Every decision was about minimizing damage, not healing it. And as the years wore on, the bloodline narrowed further. Options disappeared. Eligible partners existed only within the family itself, and each choice deepened the genetic echo. By now, the consequences were undeniable. The family knew the words. They had heard them from doctors they never went back to see. They understood, in abstract terms, what repetition does to flesh and mind. But understanding does not always lead to change. Sometimes it leads to resignation, and children born in this phase carried the weight of inevitability. From their first days, expectations were adjusted downward, not because they weren't loved, but because hope had become dangerous. Hope made the losses hurt more. It was safer to expect less, to prepare for limitations, to build a life small enough to fit inside the walls that had already claimed so many before them. And yet, even in that shrinking world, something restless remained. A look held too long on a passing car. A question asked in the wrong tone. A silence that felt less like obedience and more like observation. The bloodline was sealed, but cracks were forming, not in the genes, but in the story the family told itself. And stories once questioned begin to unravel. And the outside world was changing faster now. News traveled further. Standards shifted. What had once been dismissed as unfortunate became unacceptable. Records surfaced. Patterns emerged. A lineage that had hidden in plain sight began to draw the wrong kind of attention. And attention is dangerous when you've spent generations avoiding it. And what sealed their fate wasn't exposure. It was timing. The reckoning arrived after the damage was done, after the blood had been folded in on itself too many times to unfold again. By the time anyone truly looked, there was nothing left to save, only something to study, to document, to quietly file away as a cautionary tale. But cautionary tales don't comfort the people who live them. They don't undo the nights spent wondering why your body won't obey you, or why your thoughts feel trapped behind glass. They don't answer the question that haunted every generation born into this line: was this always going to happen, or did someone choose this for us? And because somewhere, buried beneath tradition and fear, there was a choice. And once it was made, it echoed forward, sealing the bloodline not with chains or laws, but with silence. And there is a moment in every sealed story when the weight becomes unbearable, when the past presses so hard against the present that even the most disciplined silence begins to fracture. For this bloodline, that moment didn't arrive with a scream or a crime. It arrived quietly through paperwork, through dates that didn't make sense, through patterns that refused to stay buried, and someone somewhere finally noticed the repetition. Not a single birth or a single condition, but the accumulation of them, a timeline where the same traits surfaced again and again, growing sharper with each generation. What looked like coincidence from a distance became inevitability up close. And once inevitability is recognized, it becomes impossible to ignore. And inside the family, the air changed. Conversations grew shorter, laughter felt forced. There was a shared awareness now, an understanding that whatever had once been justified as tradition was no longer defensible, even in private. The older generation sensed the end of something, though they didn't have the language for it. The younger ones felt it as confusion, as anger they couldn't name, as a pressure in their chest whenever they imagined a future that looked too much like the past. And the children born during this period were different in a way that could no longer be explained away. The symptoms were clearer, more severe. Some required constant care. Others drifted through life in a fog of partial understanding, aware enough to feel frustration but not enough to escape it. Love existed, yes, but it was a strained love, stretched thin by exhaustion and guilt. Caring for them was an act of devotion, but also a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. An outside intervention crept closer, not with force, but with questions. Polite ones at first, then firmer. School enrollment forms left unreturned. Medical follow-ups declined. Home visits postponed again and again. The family responded the only way it knew how, by closing ranks, by presenting unity as innocence, by leaning harder into the belief that outsiders couldn't possibly understand what it meant to live this way. But understanding wasn't the goal anymore. Prevention was. The world beyond the property line had learned too much to look away again. What had once been tolerated as isolation was now seen as neglect. What had once been dismissed as unfortunate genetics was now recognized as something far more deliberate. And deliberate choices carry consequences that silence can't erase. And the elders felt betrayed, not just by society, but by time itself. They had believed that if they kept their heads down, if they stayed invisible long enough, the world would simply move on without them. Instead, the world arrived at their door with clipboards and concern. And concern, to people who have survived by secrecy, feels like an accusation. And the younger generation watched all of this with a complicated mix of fear and relief. Fear of change, of being separated from the only life they had ever known. Relief at the possibility, however faint, that something might finally be different. That the cycle could be interrupted, even if it couldn't be undone. For some, that hope was the first truly dangerous thing they had ever felt, and there were moments of resistance. Doors closed, voices raised, long-held narratives repeated with more intensity, as if volume could replace validity. But the truth had already slipped through the cracks. It was in the records, in the bodies, in the undeniable resemblance between faces that should have belonged to different branches of a family tree, but didn't. And when authorities finally stepped inside, they didn't find monsters. They found people. Tired people, confused people. People who had inherited a situation they didn't create, but had been taught never to question. And that may be the most unsettling part of this story. Evil didn't announce itself here. It whispered. It hid behind loyalty and fear and the promise that staying together was safer than stepping into the unknown. And the removal, when it came, was slow and procedural. No dramatic raids, no headlines at first, just forms signed, plans made, futures redirected. Children were taken to places that felt foreign and overwhelming. Some adapted, some didn't. Adults were left behind with the ruins of a legacy they had protected for too long, now forced to confront it in silence. And what remained of the bloodline after that was fragmented, scattered. No longer sealed by proximity, but still bound by memory. You can separate people physically, but you can't separate them from what shaped them. The genetic damage didn't vanish. The psychological scars didn't fade. They simply moved into new spaces, carried forward by individuals trying to build lives without a map. And hovering over all of it was the same question, now louder than ever: if someone had spoken sooner, if someone had chosen differently, would any of this have been avoided? Or was the bloodline already doomed the moment it decided to close itself off from the world? And because fate, in stories like this, is rarely a single moment, it's a series of small decisions made out of fear, repeated until they harden into destiny. And after the separation, the story didn't end. It never does. It simply changed shape. What had once been contained within one property, one surname, began to disperse into the wider world. And with that dispersal came a new kind of horror. Not the visible kind etched into bodies, but the quiet, internal kind that follows people wherever they go. And those who were taken away entered systems that were unprepared for what they carried. Doctors could document symptoms, psychologists could name behaviors, but no one could fully untangle the history folded into their DNA. Case files grew thick. Assessments contradicted each other. Progress came in fragments. Some learned new routines, new words, new ways of being. Others retreated inward, overwhelmed by environments that demanded more than they could give. And for the first time, mirrors were unavoidable. In foster homes, group facilities, and medical wards, reflections became daily encounters. Some stared too long. Some refused to look at all. There was a dawning realization among a few of them that their bodies told a story they didn't understand, but that others seemed to read instantly. The glances lingered. The questions came carefully, if at all. Difference, once normalized inside the family, became something else entirely in the outside world. And meanwhile, those left behind in the original home experienced a different unraveling. Without children to care for, without routines shaped by constant supervision, time stretched uncomfortably wide. Rooms emptied. Silence deepened. The walls that had once felt protective now felt accusatory, as if the house itself were asking why it had been allowed to witness so much for so long. Some refused to speak about what had happened. Others couldn't stop, and regret is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once, and it rarely takes the shape you expect. For some, it came as anger, at officials, at neighbors, at a world that had finally decided to intervene after generations of looking away. For others, it came as grief for a legacy they had believed in, only to watch it collapse under scrutiny. And for a few, it came as something quieter and far more dangerous: recognition, and recognition that they had known. Maybe not in scientific terms, maybe not with full clarity, but enough to feel the wrongness pressing in year after year. Enough to sense that love, however genuine, had been used as an excuse to avoid change. That loyalty had become a cage, and that the bloodline had been sealed not by fate alone, but by fear of the unknown, and those taken into care carried that fear with them. Freedom, when it finally appeared, was disorienting. Choice felt like a trap. When you've grown up inside strict, unspoken rules, the absence of them doesn't feel liberating. It feels like standing on the edge of something vast and unstable. Some gravitated toward familiar patterns, even when those patterns hurt them. Others resisted connection altogether, afraid of repeating something they didn't fully understand. And the story began to surface in academic circles, stripped of names and locations. It became a case study, a warning, a data set. Researchers spoke in careful language about genetic bottlenecks and social isolation, about compounding risk factors and systemic failure. And while their conclusions were sound, something essential was missing. Charts don't capture the feeling of growing up knowing your future has already been narrowed. Statistics don't show the look on a child's face when they realize they are being observed not as a person, but as an outcome. And public interest flickered briefly, then moved on. There were other stories, louder ones, easier ones. This one required patience, empathy, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Most people don't want to imagine that something so extreme could persist quietly, not in some distant past, but within living memory. It challenges the comforting belief that progress is automatic, that oversight always works, that someone is always paying attention. But someone wasn't. Not for a long time, and that absence allowed the bloodline to tighten until it could no longer sustain itself. And for those who survived into adulthood, the question of legacy became unavoidable. Could they have children? Should they? Doctors offered probabilities, not certainties. Warnings, not guarantees. Some chose to end the line deliberately, seeing it as an act of mercy. Others struggled with the weight of that decision, torn between the desire for normalcy and the fear of repeating history. Love, once again, became complicated. And hovering above all of it was the realization that fate hadn't been a single, dramatic force. It had been patient, incremental, built from moments where intervention felt uncomfortable, where speaking up felt risky, where silence felt easier. Fate in this story was the result of being left alone for too long, and the bloodline may have been broken geographically, but its imprint remained, in bodies, in memories, in choices still being made years later. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: even now, the story isn't finished. It continues quietly, carried forward by people trying to live ordinary lives while bearing the extraordinary weight of what they inherited. And because once a family crosses a certain threshold, the past doesn't stay buried. It follows. It waits. And it asks, again and again, whether the cycle will truly end, or simply find a new place to hide. And by the time the story reached this point, it had stopped being about one house, one surname, or one patch of land. It had become something heavier, a lesson written in flesh and memory, carried forward by people who never agreed to be part of it. The bloodline was no longer sealed by isolation, but by awareness. And awareness can be just as heavy a burden. And for those who survived into adulthood, identity became a battlefield. They were asked to explain themselves constantly, even when no one said the words out loud. Medical forms, family history questions, casual conversations that drifted too close to subjects they didn't have language for. How do you explain that your past isn't just personal, it's systemic? That your body is evidence of decisions made before you existed? And some tried to outrun it. They moved, changed names, cut contact with anyone who knew the full story. They built new lives piece by piece, hoping distance would dilute what they carried. And for a while it worked. Jobs, relationships, a sense of almost normal. But the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when it lives inside you. A diagnosis, a genetic consultation, a moment when a doctor pauses too long before speaking, silence, once again, doing the most damage, and others went the opposite direction. They studied what had happened obsessively. They read medical journals late into the night, tracing patterns, learning terms that finally gave shape to what they had felt all their lives. Inbreeding depression, genetic drift, recessive disorders amplified by repetition, knowledge became a kind of control, a way to reclaim something from a story that had stolen so much agency. But knowledge also brought grief, because it confirmed what they had always suspected. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was cause and effect, and relationships were rarely simple. Trust didn't come easily to people raised in silence and surveillance. Love felt conditional, dangerous. The idea of starting a family carried a weight that others never had to consider. Some decided early that the line would end with them, not out of self-hatred but out of responsibility. A quiet decision rarely shared, made alone in moments of brutal honesty. Ending a bloodline sounds dramatic, but for them, it felt practical, necessary, and yet, even those choices came with grief. Because choosing not to continue is still a loss. It's mourning something that never happened, children never born, futures deliberately erased. It's standing at the edge of possibility and turning away. Not because you can't step forward, but because you're afraid of what might follow. And the original family home didn't survive much longer after everything came to light. Abandoned, it decayed quickly. Roofs collapsed, floors gave way. Nature reclaimed what secrecy had protected for so long. But decay doesn't erase history. If anything, it highlights it. Locals avoided the place. Stories circulated stripped of nuance, turned into rumors and half-truths. The house became a symbol, a warning, a curiosity for those who didn't know what it had cost the people inside it. And what's most unsettling is how easily it could have continued, how close it came to remaining hidden forever. All it required was continued disinterest, continued distance, continued belief that family matters are private matters, even when privacy becomes a shield for harm. This wasn't an ancient tragedy. It wasn't medieval or mythic. It unfolded within a system that claimed to know better, and that's the part that lingers. Not the shock, not the deformities, not even the moral outrage, but the realization that fate didn't strike like lightning. It accumulated, slowly, quietly, one unchallenged decision at a time. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because that question isn't hypothetical, it's the question every generation in this story faced, whether they admitted it or not. Stay or break away. Protect the family or protect the future. Choose loyalty or choose change. And every time, the easier answer won, until it couldn't anymore, and the bloodline didn't end in a single moment of reckoning. It faded, fragmented, dissolved into individuals scattered across places that didn't know their full story. But fading isn't the same as healing. The consequences remain, carried forward quietly, invisibly, in bodies that still bear the marks of repetition and restraint. And this is what sealed by fate really means. Not that the ending was inevitable, but that avoiding it required courage no one was ready to show until it was far too late. Fate wasn't a curse passed down from nowhere. It was a mirror held up again and again, turned away every time it became too uncomfortable to face. And now all that's left is the record, the warning, the uneasy knowledge that somewhere, right now, another family might be telling itself the same stories, using the same excuses, trusting the same silence. And because history doesn't repeat itself loudly, it whispers, and it waits for someone to listen. And what lingers after a bloodline like this doesn't announce itself, it settles. It becomes part of the background noise of ordinary life, easy to ignore if you're not listening closely. For the people who carried this history forward, survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like obligation. Like waking up every day knowing your existence was proof of something that should never have been allowed to happen, yet did. And time softened some edges but sharpened others. Physical symptoms stabilized for some, worsened for others. Mental health became the quiet battlefield no one prepared them for. Anxiety without clear origin. Depression rooted in questions that had no satisfying answers. A persistent sense of being observed, even when alone. When you grow up as evidence, it's hard to ever feel invisible in the way other people do. And attempts at normalcy were constant and exhausting. Holding a job, maintaining relationships, sitting through conversations about family history at dinner tables where everyone else spoke freely. Small talk became a minefield. Questions like, "Where are you from?" or "Do you have siblings?" carried a weight they weren't meant to. Sometimes answers were shortened, sometimes they were lies, sometimes silence did the work instead, and a few chose to speak publicly years later when the story resurfaced in fragmented forms. Interviews stripped of names, faces blurred, voices altered. Even then, they spoke carefully as if the bloodline might somehow hear them, might reach out and pull them back into its gravity. Trauma doesn't vanish just because the source is gone. It adapts. It hides in reflexes, in fear responses, in the way someone flinches at authority or recoils from questions that feel too close. And there were moments of anger, sharp and overdue. Anger at parents who chose comfort over courage, at neighbors who noticed but didn't intervene, at systems that waited until damage was irreversible before stepping in. But anger, like grief, is hard to sustain indefinitely. Eventually it gives way to something quieter and more complicated. A desire to understand without excusing, to move forward without forgetting, and genetic counseling became a turning point for many. Sitting in sterile rooms, listening to probabilities spoken in calm, measured tones, they were forced to confront the future in a way their ancestors never had. This time there were options, informed ones, painful ones, but real nonetheless. For some, that knowledge was empowering. For others, it felt like yet another burden placed on shoulders already heavy with inherited responsibility, and the idea of legacy shifted. It was no longer about continuing a name or preserving a line. It became about preventing harm, about choosing absence over repetition, silence over continuation. For people raised to believe that blood was everything, this reversal was radical. Ending the line wasn't rejection, it was protection. A final, deliberate choice made where so many others had avoided choosing at all. And still, doubt lingered. What if things could have been different this time? What if medical advances made the risks manageable? What if love was enough? These questions haunted quiet moments, especially as peers moved forward with families of their own. Watching others build what felt forbidden created a grief that had no ceremony, no acknowledgement. Society doesn't know how to mourn children who were never meant to exist, and the broader world absorbed the story in pieces. Articles written, then forgotten. Academic references cited by people who never met those affected. The bloodline became a cautionary example, abstracted and sanitized for consumption. But abstraction is a luxury reserved for those untouched by consequence. For the survivors, it remained painfully specific: a face, a name, a memory that returned uninvited. And what's most disturbing isn't that this happened. It's that it didn't require extraordinary evil. No mastermind, no single villain. Just ordinary people making small decisions that felt reasonable in the moment, repeated long enough to become irreversible. That's the truth buried beneath this story, the kind that doesn't shock, but unsettles deeply. And because if fate can be built this quietly, then it can be built anywhere. And that realization is harder to live with than any diagnosis. And in the end, what remains is not a name etched into a family tree, or a house reclaimed by weeds and rot. What remains is a warning that doesn't announce itself with sirens or headlines. It breathes, it waits, it hides inside ordinary places, behind ordinary words like family, tradition, loyalty. And the most inbred bloodline sealed by fate was never sealed by destiny alone. It was sealed by silence, by the repeated choice to look inward instead of outward, to protect the idea of family rather than the people inside it. Fate didn't arrive fully formed. It was assembled, piece by piece, through years of avoidance and fear, until the damage became too deep to reverse. And for those who survived, life became an act of quiet resistance. Every informed decision, every boundary drawn, every moment spent questioning what was once unquestionable. Their existence challenges the notion that blood must always be honored, that lineage is sacred no matter the cost. Sometimes the most moral act is not continuation, but interruption. And yet, even interruption leaves scars. You don't walk away from a sealed bloodline untouched. You carry it in your posture, in your hesitations, in the way you measure risk and intimacy. The past doesn't shout, it whispers. It asks whether you remember where you came from, even as you try to decide where you're going. And this story unsettles because it refuses to stay distant. It doesn't belong safely in another century or another country. It unfolded quietly, within systems meant to prevent it, surrounded by people who assumed someone else would step in. That assumption, the belief that responsibility belongs elsewhere, is the most dangerous inheritance of all, and history is full of horrors we tell ourselves could never happen again. But this wasn't fueled by hatred or spectacle. It was fueled by neglect, by misplaced loyalty, by the human tendency to choose comfort over confrontation. And that makes it far more repeatable than we'd like to admit. And the bloodline may have fractured, but its lesson remains intact. When families become closed worlds, when questioning is treated as betrayal, when suffering is normalized in the name of unity, fate doesn't need to intervene. It simply watches. And perhaps that is the quiet horror beneath this entire story, not that such a bloodline existed, but that it lasted as long as it did, that it required no conspiracy to survive, only silence, patience, and time. And so if this story feels heavy, if it lingers longer than you expected, that's because it isn't really about them. It's about what happens when no one speaks soon enough, when warning signs are mistaken for privacy, when blood becomes an excuse instead of a bond, and some secrets rot when exposed. Others rot when they're kept, and this one did both.